Greetings. Welcome to the first lecture of the Pandemics in History series with Professor Michael Rossi. My name is Emily Lynn Osborne, and I am the Interim Dean of the Graham School of Continuing Professional and Liberal Studies. I am also an Associate Professor in the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. I will start by saying a few words about the Graham School, as well as about the present circumstances in which we find ourselves. Those circumstances have produced the intellectual and, in a sense, infrastructural inspiration for this series. I will then turn the screen over to Zoe Eisenman, Graham's Director of Academics, who will walk us through the logistics of the webinar. Then we will start the lecture. For those of you who are new to the University of Chicago Graham School, I will take a minute to tell you who we are and what we do. The Graham School functions, in effect, as the front door of the University of Chicago. We bring the world to the University of Chicago and the University of Chicago to you, to the world. The Graham School offers a range of classes and courses of study, from professional degrees aimed at the mid-career professional to certificate programs to non-credit bearing open courses that are, as the name suggests, open to anyone. In all of our offerings, we strive to connect with curious, engaged individuals, with people who seek camaraderie and community through learning, and who want to learn more about the world, past, present, and future. In our liberal arts programs, we pride ourselves in our focus on reading foundational texts and on classroom forums that generate rigorous, generous discussion. Even now, with the shift to remote online learning, that principle and commitment to serious in-person engagement has not wavered. Tonight, we welcome you to that learning experience on a grand scale in the first of 4 lectures. And we do so at a particularly grim historical moment. As we know, the number of people who have died from COVID-19 has now reached hundreds of thousands across the globe. There is not a realm of our economic, social, and cultural worlds that has been untouched by this disease. The current pandemic has become the defining features of people's lives who serve on its front lines, from first responders and medical professionals to grocery store workers, shipping clerks, truckers, delivery drivers, and service workers of all kinds. For members of those sectors, I thank you for your service to our communities and to us all. For others, the disease has meant a new mandate of social distance that has transformed the terms of living and working. But isolation has, quite notably, also brought with it new forms of integration and interaction. The lines between the personal and the professional blur in settings such as this one, as we make home offices into lecture halls and kitchen tables into conference rooms and classrooms. The imperative of social isolation has also, in effect, brought us this lecture series as we congregate safely through screens to learn more about the history of pandemics. For while the effects of COVID-19 are unique in our lifetime, the devastation wrought by pandemic disease is not unique to the human experience. To tell us more about that history is Michael Rossi, a professor of science and medicine and a dear colleague of mine in the Department of History here at the University of Chicago. His title is officially that of assistant professor, but it is important to note that as of July 1st, he will be an associate professor, for he earned tenure this past academic year, and that takes effect in July. Michael teaches classes on medicine, disease, and society from the 16th century to the present day. His research considers more specifically how people have, through time, approached questions of beauty and truth, pain and pleasure, and malady and health. His book, The Republic of Color, Science, Perception, and the Making of Modern America, published by the University of Chicago Press, investigates the intersections of color theory with politics and ideas about aesthetics at the turn of the 20th century. Professor Rossi has published widely in both popular and scholarly peer-reviewed publications. I know that we will all learn a great deal from Michael this evening. In order to ensure that we do so, we turn to Zoe Eisenman, who will offer some guidance on the operations of this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to all. And now to Zoe.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you all for joining our presentation today. As you will have realized, this is a webinar presentation. And that means that you will be unable to unmute your microphones and that your video will not appear on the screen. You should be able to see our speaker, whoever is speaking at the moment, and also our PowerPoint presentation. You will also not be able to use the chat function, but we do want to encourage you to ask questions, and you can post a question at any time during the lecture in the Q&A box. You'll find the button to open the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be pausing at certain points during the lecture, and I'll answer some of those questions at those points, or I'll ask them to our speaker and he will answer them. I will ask the rest of the questions during the question and answer period at the end of the talk. Since all questions are queued as they come in, I will go in the order received, and there's no need to repeat your question later. They'll be saved in the question box. Due to the number of participants, we are unable to have individuals ask their own questions. I hope that makes things a little bit clearer. And now I'd like to hand things over to our speaker, Professor Michael Rossi.
Thank you, Zoe, for moderating, and thanks, Emily, for that introduction. I also want to thank everyone who helped put this together, sort of on the back end. And of course, let me express my gratitude to those of you who are watching at home. I appreciate you taking the time and energy to help think through this difficult topic at this difficult time. So first, a word of caution. For this session and for subsequent ones, we will sometimes be dealing with vivid and possibly disturbing images and descriptions. These are powerful and necessary for our purposes because they represent people's efforts to make sense of sickness and suffering. But sometimes they may be unsuitable depending on your disposition or those around you. Second, I just want to reiterate what Zoe said just now. We'll have some points for questions throughout the lectures, so please use the Q&A function to ask questions if you have them, and particularly if you find different points at which the topics we're discussing reflect the excerpts that we read for today. So at many points, I'll call your attention to the ways in which the topics are directly relevant to Boccaccio's Decameron, which we read the introduction for today. So I'd encourage you to think through those readings in particular. Finally, I want to say that there is a list of the images that we've used and their attributions at the end of the talk. And there are quite a few, so we will be posting a PDF of those, of the sort of the bibliography of the images at the end, and location TBD. So, so that's it for announcements. So with that, let's begin with some scenes of plague and some words to accompany them. So in an account from Constantinople in 1347, we read that, quote, "A serious and pestilential disease invaded humanity. Starting from the northern Black Sea, it lasted for the whole year, passing through and destroying towns as well as country areas. The calamity attacked men as well as women, rich and poor, old and young. Several homes were emptied of all their inhabitants in one day, or sometimes two. No one could help anyone else." That same year in Venice, we read that, quote, "Sailors brought in their bones a disease so violent that whoever spoke a word to them was infected and could in no way save himself from death." Or we might think about the Decameron, which we read for today, in which Boccaccio too notes the sudden presence of a mysterious disease. He remarks upon its quick onset and the sudden death that followed. He tells us about the terror that it inspired, the bodies piled up on the street. This was the bubonic plague, the so-called Black Death that scoured Europe and parts of Asia and the Middle East from the 14th through the 18th centuries. In the face of this scourge, physicians, like this gentleman shown here, physicians were helpless. They tried everything: bloodletting, fragrant substances, herbal potions, magical amulets. Nothing worked. Today, of course, we say that plague was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, discovered in 1894 by Alexandra Yersin and Shibasaburo Kitasato. It's typically carried by rats and transmitted to humans by fleas, though in its pneumonic form, it can be transmitted through the air. Since the middle of the 20th century, it has been easily treatable through antibiotics when identified early. This doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. In Madagascar in 2017, more than 200 people were killed in an outbreak of the pneumonic variety of the plague. And every year, a handful of people in the southwestern US contract plague, where it's endemic in the local rodent population. Nevertheless, in the year 2020, the Gothic horrors of the plague, as described, for instance, by Boccaccio and as depicted in old paintings, they seem like a thing of the past, the stuff of ignorance, magic, and superstition, rather than of the cool, rational gaze of biomedical science. Today, though, I'd like to take a closer look at the Black Death and successive waves of plague, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1800. Our goals in taking this closer look will be threefold. So first, I wish simply to enliven our understanding of the experiences of plague sufferers, to try to understand how precisely people experienced epidemic disease before the advent of modern biomedicine. Secondly, and following from the first, I want to get at a sense of the reasons underlying explanations of plague. The theories through which plague sufferers made sense of their disease might seem strange. Their treatments, their therapies might seem outlandish. But these were not simply random guesses, those stabs in the dark. Rather, they were attempts to figure out patterns of disease and suffering, and importantly, to make these patterns make sense against what was known about social order, right and wrong, just and unjust. Finally, I want us to start thinking more generally, for this and subsequent sessions, about disease not as purely a matter of knowledge, but about disease as a matter of understanding. That is, so not a matter simply of what a society knows about disease or facts of disease, but how that knowledge fits in with social systems, medical systems. Again, ideas not just about what is sort of normal and pathological, but ideas about what is right and just. So let's begin with the question of the experience of plague. To do this, we'll turn our gaze back to the 14th century, back to 1347, when a seemingly new disease suddenly appeared on the landscape. And what we're going to see is that, as strange as many of the 14th century experiences of disease might seem to us today, the people who recorded them were astute observers of the world around them. They wrote down in fine and often consistent detail the things that they saw, and from these records we can construct a very vivid experience of epidemic disease 400 years ago. So what did victims of Black Death observe about plague? Well, for one thing, they saw that the disease had distinct symptoms and a distinct prognosis or outlook. It would begin suddenly when seemingly healthy people would be gripped by fevers, chills, pain, and nausea. Close inspection would reveal the presence of painful boils on the neck, armpits, or groins of plague sufferers. These were called buboes and are the defining feature that gave bubonic plague its name. And here, this is a scene of a patient with some physicians. And if we zoom in, we can see that the patient is gesturing to the bump, to what would be the bump under his arm. This is the bubo of his bubonic plague. And here also, we see Saint Roch. This is a plague saint who we'll hear more about later. But right now, again, I just want to call your attention to show you how he's gesturing at the characteristic bubo on his leg. Right, so the first symptoms are, again, nausea, pain, and the sudden swellings of buboes near the lymph nodes. As the disease set in with alarming rapidity, some victims would begin bleeding continuously from all of their orifices. Others would vomit blood. Some would become covered with spots or bruises from subcutaneous bleeding, and the extremities of some victims would turn black and decay. Incoherence, ranting, and seizures often accompanied plague. And death arrived fast and very often. According to many accounts, most people succumbed to plague within 3 to 5 days, although if one managed to stay alive for that long, plague could linger for weeks. Sometimes we see people depicted as being struck down in the street, falling dead where they stood, like this person who was just moments before helping to bear up the body of another plague victim and is now being struck down by plague. And again, we know it's plague because, once again, we see the characteristic red bump on his neck. So that was one thing. Plague was distinct for being fast, lethal, and very unpleasant. For another thing, commentators frequently remark that plague killed all members of society equally. Other dreaded diseases, smallpox, measles, dysentery, leprosy. The list goes on. The world was not disease-free or free of epidemic disease at this point. But these other dreaded diseases could be, and were often seen as principally diseases of the poor or the elderly or the very young. Plague, in contrast, seems to strike everyone more or less equally. So here, for example, is a painting from Sicily, a fresco from Sicily, circa 1445, in which plague, in the form of a skeleton riding a decaying horse, marauds through society. And here I want to call your attention especially to, so he has a bow and arrow, and he's shooting arrows. Here he's shooting arrows of plague. So we often see, in this period, we often see disease, particularly epidemic disease, depicted as arrows, either being shot by death itself, or maybe sometimes by a wrathful god. And so here we see the bodies of some wealthy people who have been felled by plague. Over to the left of the painting, whoops, wrong way, excuse me. Over to the left of the painting here, we see some of the very poor. These people have survived plague and are sort of maimed and emaciated, and here are some of their dead neighbors. And finally, over on the right side of the painting, here we see another sort of common trope. This is sort of the oblivious wealthy people who are playing music and enjoying themselves as death bears down on them. So this theme of painting was a theme called the Triumph of Death, and it was a popular one in times of plague. We also see this idea of the universality of plague in another sort of genre painting called the Dance Macabre. So as with the Triumph of Death theme, the idea of a dance macabre predates 1347, or predates the plague, but it took on great prominence in times of plague. And so what we're going to be looking at here, and for the next couple of slides, is a dance macabre from Lübeck, from a chapel in Lübeck. It was destroyed during World War II, but we have it preserved in black and white photographs. And what you're going to be seeing is a painting that was done on 4 walls of a chapel. So as we go through this, you can imagine that you're standing in the chapel and you're seeing this dance macabre. These skeletons will be claiming members of society in sort of declining order. And you could imagine sort of standing in the chapel, looking all around you and seeing this this sort of display of death. And so here, for instance, we see death. These skeletons are inviting a pope, an emperor, and an empress to come dance with them. Let's see. Here we have a cardinal, a king, and a bishop. Let's see. Further still, we have here a abbot, a knight in his armor, a monk, and a mayor. Further still, let's see. There's a canon, sort of a lesser clergyman, a noble person of lesser rank, and a physician, importantly. So a physician at this point is sort of a middling member of society. Further still, we have a banker, a curate, another sort of church official, a merchant, and a parish clerk. Finally, sort of down towards the lower echelons of the social ladder, we see a craftsman, a hermit, and a peasant. And finally, here we see the sort of generic representations of people that might be claimed by plague. This is a youth, a maiden, and here a small baby. And in each one of these, and oftentimes, as you could see from these, like death is dancing and the people are sort of resisting. Often with this genre, there would be poems attached to each figure. And so each figure would, in verse, would deliver a reason why death should not take them, and death would invariably answer them in the negative, usually in some saucy fashion. All right, so first, we know that plague had clear symptoms and a clear prognosis. Second, its reach is universal. Everyone could be touched by plague. Third, insofar as plague killed everyone, accounts from the period emphasize not just the pain of individuals, but the social devastation that plague visited upon whole communities. So we see accounts of cities ground to a halt, bodies piled up in the street with too few living to bury the dead. And this particularly gruesome tableau is by Gaetano Zumbo from the late 1600s. Unlike many of the pieces we've been seeing, this is sort of a relief sculpture. It's a piece in wax about this big, and sort of a diorama of plague victims. Those who remained are often depicted as living in fear of one another. We read a bit about this in the Decameron today, right? We hear about doctors who are afraid to treat their patients, clergy who are afraid to minister to their congregations, parents rejecting children, children rejecting parents. Here we see, here's someone rejecting their child. Here we see another common trope. This is a trope that we see often in the paintings from this period, a child attempting to nurse from a dead mother, sort of driving home the rapidity and the severity with which plague affects sort of everyone in society. We see this also in this painting from Michael Swerts from 1652 over here. Again, we see similar tropes. Child nursing from the dead mother, sort of bodies piled in the streets. So finally, and I think this is possibly the most important thing that we get from accounts of the experiences of plague, one gets a sense that plague was terrifying, not simply because of the speed at which it inflicted gruesome death, or the universality with which it claimed its victims, or even because of the scale of suffering that it caused. Rather, one gets a sense that plague was terrifying because it was inexplicable. In the eyes of the keen observers of the 14th century, it seemed unlike any other malady to have visited humankind. So previously, and many commentators say exactly this, previously, epidemics could be understood as akin to other disasters. They're like disasters like war or famine or earthquake or fires. These were awful, but these tended to be localized. Plague was different, appearing to strike everywhere, indiscriminately and without reason. It appeared to many like the end of the world. And this painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder from 1562 demonstrates this very idea. So at first glance, we might take it to be a painting of a war scene, right? So here we see, some burning landscapes, right? And there's some sunken ships in the background. Here's an army on the march. But when we look closer, we see that the marauding army is death itself in the form, again, of animate skeletons. And here they are, they're sweeping down upon the population of this land and killing everyone in front of them suddenly and indiscriminately. Here again, we see death on horseback, and these skeletons, again, the embodiment of death, are sort of herding the villagers of this community into a coffin over here. Let's see, again, along the lines of the theme of the Danse Macabre or the Triumph of Death. Here in this corner, we see a king struck down, sort of futilely reaching for his gold, and death, of course, is helping itself. Over here, we see a dinner party interrupted by the onset of sudden death as a backgammon board is upended and dinner is interrupted. Up here, we see in this corner, in the sort of top left corner of the painting, we see death literally ringing the death knell, or sort of ringing the death toll, from which we get the word, announcing that the end of the world is at hand. And finally, here in this lower right corner, sort of compositionally, the last thing you would look at, well, one might read this as an optimistic moment or as a deeply pessimistic moment. But either way, here we see a pair of young lovers who are harmonizing with one another, literally making music with one another, while death serves as their accompanist. So I guess on that happy note, maybe we could pause for a question or two right here.
All right, well, we've got some really good ones coming in. The first one I wanted to ask was from Karen Walker. She asks, why are the people representing death in the paintings black? So in the Danse Macabre painting, I think that's the one she was talking about.
Oh, I think because they're meant to be depicting corpses in states of decay. So in other forms of Danse Macabre, like sometimes these skeletons, so they're supposed to be skeletons, they're supposed to be animate skeletons. In other sorts of genre, they'll be, sometimes they're depicted as more or less skeletal, and there might be bleached white bones. Other times they will be depicted as sort of desiccated corpses. But that's more or less why. It's a sort of, I don't want to say it's a naturalistic depiction of a supernatural thing, but it is, these are fairly naturalistic and empirical people that we're dealing with.
Right, and then a couple more here. So in past pandemics, how soon did people realize it was indeed a global or international pandemic?
Well, so certainly in, I can't speak about the plague of Justinian, but certainly there was a sense very early on of the spread of pandemics. So we get accounts from 1347, which is fairly early. Again, the first account we read from Constantinople suggested that the plague had come from somewhere in the east. And so what we find is that although medical authority is not exactly up on this immediately, But we find that people understand pretty quickly that when a ship full of sailors with plague comes into your community will likely get plague as well. So in that sense, you can sort of, you know where the ship came from, and you could sort of ascertain, or you could speak to people on the ship and they say, yes, there was plague in, there's plague in Bologna, and now you have it in Venice, or something like that. That wouldn't be by ship, but you get the idea.
Okay. And that sort of leads to this next question. What did people think caused the plague?
Great question. So, well, let's see, there's a number of ways to answer that question. So maybe this is a good chance to move into our, into sort of the next section of the talk and talk a little bit about the idea of reason. Let's see. So, so this would be the sort of addressing the question of how. So we've talked about the experiences of people going through the sort of trying to describe what happened when plague hit a community. So now we're going to talk about how people made sense of the plague, right? And so in order to understand how people made sense of plague, how people sort of made reason out of what seemed like an unreasonable thing, it's necessary first to understand the dominant medical system of the time. So in orthodox scholarly, so first thing to know, and this is, as a historian of medicine, this is both hard to imagine and fun to try to wrap your head around. So please try to indulge your imagination. But in orthodox scholarly medicine of the period, there was no such thing as the idea of contagion. There was a folk belief that people could pass disease from one person to another. But for sort of learned medicine, there was no sense that disease would be carried or conveyed by proximity from one person to another. Certainly no sense that tiny microorganisms cause disease. These would be the beliefs of sort of the unlearned, the peasants, right? Instead, most scholarly, which is to say like university educated doctors, thought that health and disease was regulated by the balance of four humors in the body. And so we see the four humors here. They were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And these four humors corresponded with things like dispositions. So if someone had a lot of yellow bile in their body, they would have a choleric temperament. They would be angry, right? If someone had a lot of black bile, they might be melancholic or sort of prone to melancholy. Phlegmatic people would have a lot of phlegm. Sort of wise and gentle people would have a sort of an abundant balance of blood. And as you can see from this chart, the humors mapped onto other things like the elements, fire, earth, water, and air, and sort of the qualities like heat or dryness, wetness or coldness. And so in this way, the humors could sort of explain various things about people's dispositions and their propensity to either be sick or well under certain conditions. And so the basic idea, and we could talk more about this in Q&A because humoral systems are actually, they seem they seem quite rudimentary, but actually it's sort of an algorithm that yields enormous complexity. But the basic idea here is that when the humors are out of balance, the patient was sick. And when the humors got back into balance, the patient would get better. And so it's the doctor's job to know what is causing the humors to become unbalanced and what could be done to restore the person to health and humoral balance, or humoral balance and health. Right, so plague, doctors thought, was a humoral imbalance caused by a bad conjunction of stars and planets. So when a bad astrological event occurred, they thought it would sort of corrupt the atmosphere and create poison air. And this is what you're seeing in this picture. And in fact, the word pestilence sort of connoted a noxiousness or bad air. And this bad air in turn would sort of move over the face of the earth, killing people by contaminating or sort of unbalancing the humors of their body. And this is how one could explain why sort of whole communities, whole cities would come down with plague, because the sort of a massive bad air had descended on them, and then maybe the wind would blow the massive bad air over to the next city, and so on and so forth. All right, so what to do about this? Well, if plague was indeed caused when humors became corrupted with bad air, there were two main orthodox lines of medical defense. So first, one might simply try to lance the bubo in order to release the corrupt humors, as shown here. And this woodcut from 1482. So the idea here is that the swelling of the bubo was really the body trying to expel bad humors from the body. And so the physician, by lancing the bubo and releasing all the liquid inside, would be helping the body to do its natural work in expelling disease. One might also take blood from other parts of the body with a similar result. This was a practice called venesection, and we'll come back to it again and again because it was overwhelmingly common right up into the 20th century as a sort of therapeutic practice. All right, so that's one thing you could do. You could take blood. Or one might attend more directly to the matter of pestilent air, which caused plague, usually by burning fragrant substances, so spices or rosemary or juniper. So here in this painting from 1843, sort of looking back on the plagues of the 1600s, we see a rather dramatic description of a dramatic depiction of a religious figure preaching while wearing a brazier. This is like a metal pan of some burning substance on his head. And this was done to keep away the bad air. Right? So the idea is you'd make a cloud of something smelling good around you to keep the bad air out. We should also notice that in the background here, we can also see these people who are bearing a plague victim are also carrying a torch. This was not to light their way, but rather, again, to sort of create a fragrant or pleasing smelling air around them in order to ward off the plague. And so if you were too poor to afford something like spices, you didn't have to burn something. There are also other means. You might simply try sprinkling some vinegar around the floor of your hut. Again, just in order to drive off the pestilent air that caused the plague. So these were were early on anyway, the most orthodox learned medical approaches to the plague. So bloodletting of some sort on the one hand, or creating a better atmosphere around one on the other. The problem with these approaches, however, as many doctors during the time remarked, was that they did not appear to be very effective. As one physician recalled, and I'll quote him directly, quote, this is from 1392, a physician recalled, quote, "The mortality of plague rendered doctors useless and put them to shame." Right? Indeed, in defiance of the best medical theory of the time, it appeared to many observers that plague was actually passed from person to person. Now, it wasn't clear precisely what the mechanism was. So perhaps people had sort of consumed or breathed in the bad air that had been caused by the misaligned stars. And in this manner, they carried it to other victims sort of through their breath. If you remember that first idea that if you would even speak to someone with plague, you could come down with plague. Or perhaps another thought was that maybe the bad air sort of inundated people's clothing like smoke. If you've ever been in a smoke-filled bar or a smoky room or something like this, you might have had the experience of leaving and finding that your clothes would smell like smoke for days. Well, this would be sort of an analogy to the way that plague might be passed from person to person. Perhaps, there's a number of things, perhaps people with plague exuded this bad air through their pores. It wasn't very clear. But here we see one mode of protecting against this sort of airborne and contagious idea of the plague. This is a plague suit worn by doctors in the 16th and 17th centuries. So the suit is made of waxed cloth in order to repel the bad airs. The beak, this sort of beak contraption here, which is exaggerated in the picture as really a beak, but the beak contraption would be stuffed with fragrant substances of some sort of potpourri, perhaps. The goggles are made of glass, again, everything to sort of keep air from the body. And here a taper or a stick helps the doctor to, it's something it's often referred to as an ostensor, right? It points to the different, it points to what the doctor would have his assistants do to manipulate plague victims. The point, though, is that this suit, again, to be worn specifically by doctors, was a tacit admission that plague was contagious, at least in some ways, right? So again, the wax would keep the plague from inundating you, inundating the clothes. The sort of air tightness would keep the plague off the skin. And of course, it's impossible not to think about our own face masks here. But remember, it's not a microbe that's being defended against, but rather some sort of bad air that somehow surrounded plague victims. So whatever was the case, it seemed clear, at least in a general sense, that medicine, and Orthodox medicine in particular, was poorly equipped to deal with the plague. And here, actually, the text of this particular broadside is both kind of informing you on this new form of plague doctor in Rome, and you could also see that over here in this corner, there's some children running away from the doctor, and the text is sort of vaguely satirical. So you get a sense that the plague doctor was not a respected figure. So against the plague, there were a couple of different remedies that were sort of non-medical in nature. The first, recommended by many doctors, was simply to run. And so we read about the option of flight in the Decameron today, in which a group of wealthy Florentines go to, well, they get what we would now call sheltering in place in a mountain villa, and they tell each other stories to pass the time. Sort of this, an early idea of trying to find content in order to pass the time. And so that seems pretty straightforward. Fleeing seems like a straightforward approach. As this woodcut shows, though, it's not always as easy as it sounds. So first of all, getting out of town was expensive. This is an option for the very wealthy, like the people that you read about for today. Even skilled craftspeople, so those who otherwise would have been considered to have means, could not get very far. Besides which, leaving town often meant leaving businesses, and so that's entailed a significant financial risk. Secondly, as we see sort of here, there was the distinct possibility that even if one was able to leave town, there would be nowhere to go, right? And so here we see a presumably plague-free community barring the way of these people who are fleeing plague-infected London, right? So they're trying to keep their own plague community free of plague, and so are thereby sort of forbidding travelers from entering their community. Here, of course, we see another problem, which is that even if you did find a plague-free place to flee to, plague might follow you anyway, right? This simply added to the confusion because there were cases, of course, of plague spreading without any apparent contact with prior plague victims. So that made the contagion theory seem less viable, although it also seemed viable in other circumstances. So again, a confusing set of circumstances to reason through. All this to say that flight was seemingly the best option in many people's opinions, but not always a viable one. Those who did stay might appeal to God's mercy. So whether contagious or non-contagious, to many commentators, it appeared that plague was a form of divine punishment for human wickedness, a little bit like the great flood of Noah, but more violent. And if God's wrath was the cause of plague, one cure was repentance. In German-speaking parts of Europe, a group known as the Flagellants emerged following waves of plague in 1349. This was a sort of described in texts of the time as a leaderless or acephalous group who would sort of wander through the middle of Europe from city to city, mortifying their flesh with whips as a form of penitence for humanity's evils. Less dramatically, but no less prominently, we see cults of Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch appearing. So people would pray to these saints to intercede with God on the behalf of beleaguered populations or themselves personally. So this is a plague amulet from the 1600s. Here you see Saint Sebastian. Here you see Saint Roch. This is a sort of inexpensive woodcut. And the idea that would be that you would put this print up on your door or something like that, and that would protect you from plague through divine intervention. And so why Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch? Well, let's see. Here we remember this plague. We remember this painting shows a man being struck by plague where he stood. But if we look up further, if we look up here, we see at the top of this painting is Saint Sebastian pleading for the lives of the town's inhabitants with God in this case, or perhaps Jesus. I think it's supposed to be God. Pleading for the lives of the town's inhabitants. And if we look closer at Saint Sebastian, we can see that he is depicted as being shot full of arrows. And that is because in the Christian tradition, Saint Sebastian was put to death by arrows for his Christian belief, but was saved by divine will. And so if you remember, arrows were often sort of the symbolic avatars of plague and other epidemic disease. And so the symbolic resonance between arrows and plague made Saint Sebastian a likely saint to pray to if one wanted salvation from the arrows of plague. So here and here, we also saw Saint Roch before, Roch before. He was a somewhat newer saint. This is a pilgrim who was said to have survived the plague. And again, he's shown here pointing that characteristic bubo on his thigh. And as a plague survivor too, he also depicted the possibility of divine salvation from the plague. And this is another depiction of Saint Roch, again, showing you the bubo on his thigh. Finally, if God was angry at the wickedness of society, one solution was to banish or kill the wicked. Usually this meant the marginalized of society, the very poor or sex workers, ethnic minorities, enemies of the state, or infidels. Jewish communities in particular were often targeted as belonging to a vast conspiracy to poison, to spread the poison of plague throughout Europe in an effort to destroy Christianity. And here we see a woodcut from the Nuremberg Chronicle circa 1493, showing a pogrom against Jewish people at Strasbourg, although these were widespread across Europe. Perhaps needless to say, Jewish communities suffered as much from plague as all other communities did, and commentators remark upon this, but this did not seem to provide a defense against persecution. So those are some of the those are some orthodox medical responses to plague and some less orthodox, more folk or communal responses. Maybe now would be another good time to pause for some questions.
Okay, again, lots of great questions coming in. This one is from Shelley Michael. If people understood that contagion was passed through contact with sick people or with objects those people had touched, was the thought that people with certain humors or tendencies were more susceptible to contamination?
Yeah, exactly. So one of, and this is, this is a good question to lead us into next week. So one of the problems with a contagion theory of disease is that it doesn't always explain things very well, right? So it doesn't explain, you would think that if there's some sort of poison that's being passed from person to person, everyone should get sick, and that's not the case. And so, yeah, so one way of explaining this is that there's a certain susceptibility to disease brought on by one sort of humoral disposition. This seems like a sort of ad hoc explanation in the minds of many academic physicians of the time. It seems far more likely to explain that some sort of environmental imbalance has caused disease. But yes, so you will see. You do see these sort of hybrid explanations. So a humoral disposition, well into the 19th century, we see the idea that people have maybe a humoral disposition to certain pathogens, right? So even once you have a germ theory, you can still have germ theory and humoral theory. The last thing I'll say about that, and this becomes especially important when we talk about cholera, is that humoral theories also explain social position pretty well. So it is possible, so people also observe, not in the case of plague so much, but certainly in the case of cholera, that cholera victims are likely to be poor, likely to live in these sort of crowded tenements. And the idea is that if you're poor, you might be humorally disposed to be poor, right? And therefore, you might be more susceptible to disease, you might be more susceptible to wickedness or lewdness, right? So all these undesirable characteristics could explain why people who were thought less desirable got sick more than sort of the upper echelons of society. So yeah, so again, a complex and variable system, but and we'll talk more about that next time too.
Okay, cool. And then here's another one. This is from an anonymous person. Do we know if plague suits and masks were at all effective in protecting the physicians of the time from contracting plague?
Short answer is no. I mean, we don't know because there's no good epidemiology. I think that they usually seem to have sort of a patina of ridicule about them when you see them described in texts from the period. So one gets a sense that that at least observers, people who are trying to record these, record what plague times were like, were not convinced. But yeah, there's no way to tell how effective they would be.
Okay. And then were medical practices helpful at all, despite the misconceptions about the plague's causes?
Oh, great. Okay, so that leads us really well into our next section. Yeah. So the question of efficacy, written in kind of as a writer, is the question of the way that plague suits might have functioned. The question of efficacy is a complicated and fascinating one in the history of medicine. So the obvious answer to the question of were any of these measures effective would be no, of course, right? So we would think venesection or smelling potpourri or self-flagellation. None of these would be considered an especially efficacious therapeutic from a contemporary medical standpoint. A less obvious, but I think more instructive way to approach the question is to sort of ask what efficacy means in a given context. So for us today, medical efficacy usually refers to some sort of rate of cure. But that's really only the tip of the iceberg. A more expansive notion of efficacy would encompass not simply rates of cure, but systems of explanation. So we'd want to know sort of not only whether a cure works, but why do people believe in it? So what allows a cure to become used in the first place and therefore effective? Or even more broadly, how does a cure help us to understand disease? And cures are a way of not only sort of ridding disease, but of helping people to understand disease. And this in part is what's so fascinating about plague. So in the face of recurrent episodes of periodic mass death, we see communities of people struggling not simply to know pandemic sickness, but to understand it, right? So to try to force what seemed like a senseless disease to make sense with their view of how the world worked, right? And what constituted just forms of suffering, how the laws of nature, the laws of human beings, and the laws of the divine all kind of work together. And from these struggles to understand pandemic plague, a new way of dealing with disease emerged. Today, we would call these public health measures. And although I should really emphasize that at the time these measures were uncoordinated and scattershot, they represent some of the first instances of the power of the state, of the power of state administration being directed at matters of mass disease. So to take one sort of characteristic example, here are some typical measures passed in London in 1641. And you can see this is just a broadside labeled, certain orders thought meet to be put in execution against the infection of the plague, right? So these are things that are mandated that people should do in times of plague. And so here you can see these are very limited in number. There are only 10 in number, and they are limited in scope, but they are quite dramatic in the sorts of authority and action that they enable. And since this text is small, I'll just give you just a few here, sort of illustrated in this woodcut from the 1660s. So among other things that these orders decreed was that they mandated that people suspected of having plague be shut in their houses, quote, whether they die or not, end quote. So the confinement in one's house would be at the expense of the person confined, providing they could afford it. And this decree also mandated that the words, God have mercy on this house or God have mercy on their soul be written on the houses. And here we can see in the foreground, this is the fate that is suffered by just the people in this house. So there's a padlock on the door, there's a guard outside, and their house has been labeled as a house containing people with pestilence. Another thing that these acts mandated were that the streets were to be fumigated and kept free of stench. So here we see a larger version of that brazier that was burning on the Solomon eagle, that's the prophet's head that we saw earlier. And so again, this idea of fumigation and keeping the streets free of stench again involved sort of burning fragrant substances. It also involved removing trash and bodies. If you remember for today, Boccaccio mentions the stench of bodies, of the unburied bodies decaying. It might also involve closing malodorous businesses. So things like metalworks and butcher shops gave off bad smells, which again, could perhaps be the source of plague. Finally, most importantly, this bill gave broad police powers to a newly defined group of officials called health magistrates, allowing them to enforce confinement, enforce street cleaning, and enforce the removal of bodies and the fumigation of streets, quote, by whatever means necessary. Right? So it gives them incredible power to restrict what we now call people's liberties. And in other places, we see other sorts of measures. So we see health magistrates empowered to burn the possessions of the dead, which is what's happening here. We also see more in continental Europe than in England. We see health magistrates given the power to confine plague victims to what are called pest houses or plague hospitals. Plague hospitals are not a place where people would go to recover from the plague. Rather, it's a place where they would go to be isolated from society until they died, or until health magistrates deemed them well enough to rejoin their community. Perhaps the most enduring public health intervention was devised in the 1400s, when the health magistrates of the city-state of Venice began to compel all incoming ships to stop at fortified islands in the Venetian harbor. This is actually the harbor of Naples, not Venice, but it was a similar principle. These way stations were called lazarettos after St. Lazarus, the patron saint of the sick and diseased. And the idea was that travelers were to disembark at these way stations and air out all the items and cargo on their boat to get rid of these bad vapors and to see who would come down with the disease and who died and who lived. The practice in Venice lasted for 40 days, giving this new measure its name that it goes by today, quarantine. On land in the 17th and 18th centuries, authorities also imposed cordons sanitaires, these well-policed borders to restrict the movement of people and goods in and out of cities or regions thought to be suffering from or vulnerable to plague. And so this is just a broadside, a sign that was put up announcing the institution of cordons sanitaires in Ferrara, a city in Italy, in January of 1681. And this states basically that a neighboring town had banned trade with Dalmatia and Turkey because there was plague there. Again, to this question of how when people knew whether plague was coming, it's fairly early on. So Dalmatia and Turkey had plague, and so this sign says there's no more trade with Dalmatia and Turkey in Ferrara under pain of death. And so this is a very serious measure. And again, this is another another cordon sanitaire instituted because of plague, in this case, from Cologne, Dusseldorf, or Vraslavia. It says no contact with people, animals, etc. From these places, again, on pain of death. Finally, this one is particularly interesting. This is a sign proclaiming that a system of health passes would be introduced to help combat the transmission of plague. And so what this policy of issuing health passes means is that, well, first of all, in order to issue a policy of health passes, you need to have health inspectors, right? So you need to have people who are authorized to inspect other people to rule as to whether they are healthy enough to be outside, to be in the world, and to travel, right? So this means that the state could, inspect people, rule as to their health, and give them a pass or not to enable their viability for movement. So two things are noteworthy here, I think. So first of all, by and large, historians of medicine often argue that of all the measures deployed against plague between 1300 and 1800, it was these last that seem in retrospect to be most effective. Through the imposition of quarantine, many medical historians argue that human beings first gained a measure of control over pandemic illness. So quarantine, the first true state-run public health measure, was a success. Secondly, and more interesting, I think, is it's noteworthy that none of these measures employed new medical knowledge about plague. No new medical theories underwrote these public health measures. There's no sort of discovery about plague that subtended the empowering of health magistrates. No new knowledge or facts particularly compelled these measures. Rather, these novel public health measures entail a new understanding of the relationship between disease and society, one which called upon greater powers of the state in order to ensure the health of populations. And so in this sense, plague did indeed mark the end of the world, rather the end of one world and the beginning of another one. This glimmer of an idea, this notion that state authority could and should be used to regulate the health of individuals and communities, represented a new understanding of disease. And again, although it was only ad hoc and scattershot in the time of plague, this idea expanded rapidly throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, growing to a matter of national and international importance over the course of the 19th century, and especially in the face of the next of our four pandemics, the cholera years of the 19th century. And so we'll look at this next Wednesday. But for now, let's take a couple more questions. And that's the end of the lecture.
Thank you so much, Michael. Well, we have a whole bunch of questions. So I'm going to start going through some of our questions now. I am going to sort them a little bit. There's a bunch that have to do with the Boccaccio reading. And so I'm going to sort of save those for a little bit and start with the ones that have to do with the presentation. And
Sure.
For those of you who are asking about the paintings, the slide that's up right now has the painting attributions on them.
And yeah, and we'll put this online since I know it's small, but
yeah, we are going to be posting the PowerPoint of the PowerPoint and also the video later. So you will be able to see that again. So I'm going to start at the beginning here. John Hamilton says, I thought I read somewhere that the bubonic plague killed 1/3 of the European population in the 14th century. Is that right?
yeah, that seems to be, that's the figure that I've most often read. Yeah.
Okay. L. Burton says, how did they find out about the plague? Was it all anecdotal? Today we have newspapers, etc. It seems like hearing only anecdotes would fuel chaos and panic.
Well, in some ways, it was both anecdotal and evidentiary. So like what you would see is you would hear accounts of plague from travelers, basically. And then at least initially, it certainly did fuel panic. As you can see, fueled mass flight. There was we'll see, especially in, well, cholera more than plague, but it fueled mass violence, right? So particularly pogroms against Jewish people, but also other Jewish communities, but also other marginal members of society. And actually, you see one thing we didn't get to talk about was you see a real breakdown in sort of what we've now called sort of scientific epistemology. So we didn't get to talk too much about there was some proliferation of various what we now call quack cures for plague. So like people would sort of sell their own plague remedy. As I said, I think the respect for doctors was at an all-time low because doctors couldn't do anything. So it would fuel mass chaos. But as I said before, people were also very astute observers of their surroundings, right? So again, if you they're very good at conveying information from person to person.
All right. Dana asks, where in the Southwest USA did you say the plague is endemic?
Kind of all over the Southwest. I mean, like the last thing I read was not too long ago, some people caught plague in Yellowstone Park, I think. Again, though, it's you could treat it with like Cipro or like sort of common antibiotics today. So if you catch it early enough, it's not fatal. I mean, it's still again, you need a good public health infrastructure. So again, for the plague outbreak in Madagascar, there was the public health infrastructure was less well developed, and so more people died.
Did people understand the connection with rats and fleas?
Not evidently, no. No, in fact, you hear accounts. So you hear accounts of some public health measures. So of course, we talked about the ways in which health magistrates would sort of clean out the cities. You do hear some accounts of often medieval cities were overrun with stray animals, like especially stray cats. And so sometimes as a public health measure, the health magistrates would get rid of all the cats because they're sort of a malign animal. And when you get rid of the cats, of course, the rats multiply and the fleas multiply and makes the problem worse. So no. And this was also, but yeah, and so no, and that's also, that's, you could tell, they're sort of unclear as to what goods would cause plague and what wouldn't. You definitely hear accounts of plague being transferred by bolts of cloth. You might get a bolt of cloth full of fleas and open it up and then just introduce plague into your tailor shop and then into your community. So yeah, no, not well described until the 1890s.
Would the people of the 14th century be aware of the plague of Justinian? Did they make a connection with that? That's from Krista.
Good question. They did not, at least not most commentators did not. Most commentators, anyway, overwhelmingly stress that this was a plague unlike any other. So they would have been surely they would have been aware of other epidemic disease, but and they would have been aware of like sort of severe epidemic disease, but these sort of what seemed to them to be the global scope of it is generally described as something that had never been seen before. That having been said, of course, if we think about our own some of our own sort of public responses to COVID-19, of course, people today say we could never have seen this coming or we've never seen anything like this. So historical memory is short.
That's for sure. Did the bubonic plague morph or change over the years, or did it virtually look the same from 1300 to 1800? This is from Gina.
Good question. So, yeah, there is some, I guess we can answer this sort of, we could sort of look to there's been some good genetic studies of plague, which seem to suggest that like bubonic plague basically was its virulent self by the time it came to Europe. There are sort of earlier versions of plague that lacked certain mutations that allow it to be aerosolized and decrease its potency. So it's hard to tell whether sort of like by genetic studies, whether it morphed over the course of its run. There's a lot of debate among historians of medicine who are sort of not in my sort of more social history of medicine as to whether whether perhaps there was a bubonic plague outbreak in the 1890s or through the early 20th century, which is where we got this idea of Yersinia pestis. There's a lot of debate over whether the Black Death was actually that plague, was actually Yersinia pestis. So like, some people say, well, maybe it was anthrax, maybe it was some sort of hemorrhagic fever that no longer exists. Sometimes accounts don't seem to add up with what we know about plague. So we see accounts of plague in the winter when you'd expect it to be cold and fleas would be less abundant. There are sort of the epidemiology of plague sometimes doesn't add up. So it seems as severe in the 1600s as in the 1300s, even though sort of routes of trade were much tighter in the 1300s, or even in the 1600s and the 1300s. So there is some debate. For the most part, though, and then descriptions can sometimes be confusing. Sometimes plague looks like smallpox, or because in its there's a variety of plague where you sort of you get these spots all over your body, and so that can sometimes be mistaken for smallpox. Short answer though is that it seems like plague is pretty distinct in most of its sort of three great pandemic iterations.
Claire asks, is art an accurate reflection of the reality of the Black Death?
That's such a good word, reality. Well, it is. I don't know. I would actually want to ask the question. I would want to put the question back to the questioner to ask, like, what is desired from accurate representation of reality? It's certainly an accurate representation of what people thought was going on, right? And so it's an accurate representation of sort of externalizing internal realities, I guess is one way of saying it. And I think we can certainly sort of key textual accounts to there's enough consistency between textual accounts and graphic accounts, and between textual accounts, to say with fair certainty that, again, things like fleeing from plague, as we read with Boccaccio, was pretty common. And of course, we see that many observers are really intent on showing the location of buboes and things like this. They're comparatively few, however, like anatomical drawings. Like there wasn't much of that in that period to begin with, or at least not much that has the sort of the tenor of anatomical drawing of today. So you're not looking for the same thing as you are in a painting as you are in, say, Alexander Yerson's photograph of Yersinia pestis, is what I would say.
Here's another couple about the art part. Michael Darr asks, there's something weirdly romantic about the portrayal of death chivalrously asking for a dance. What's your interpretation of the decision to portray the disease in a romantic way like that?
Oh gosh, I never thought, it's more often interpreted as death is sort of mockingly forcing people like of high station to dance and to sort of sort of cavort with death. That having been said, though, I actually wrote a piece for the London Review of Books recently about just this topic, which is to say that you definitely, and this is me editorializing, but I definitely think that there is a much richer sort of symbolic sense of the depth of disease that's conveyed through sort of manifestations of an anthropomorphic figure of death versus our own sort of fixation on just viral particles and things like this. So yeah, as far as death being chivalrous, I don't know, I haven't heard that interpretation before. But yeah, I guess they are elegant, the figures, invariably.
And these two sort of go together. So Caitlin Long asks, were any of the paintings commissioned? How did anyone profit off mass suffering, such as by providing entertainment, advertising remedies, etc.? I feel in this time it's crucial for uplifting entertainment, not necessarily for profit. And Paula Duffy also asked, these images span 3 centuries. How widely were they seen by the populace? Who commissioned them? Were the artists in the 17th century familiar with the earlier images?
So last question, the answer would be yes. As far as the sort of commission history, I mean, some of these were commissioned, others were more popular pieces. So like some of the woodcuts that I showed would have been less expensive. I think I showed one woodcut that was a plague amulet. So that sort of thing was a functional device that would have been sort of fairly widespread, fairly accessible. So most of the things that are prints would have been available in book form, especially sort of further into the 16 and 1700s. Again, not like as widely as our printing today, but often in the form of forgeries too. There was a heavy sort of bootleg sort of industry at the time. So as far as the actual economic side of like profiting from plague? I don't actually know. That's a very good question.
Right. Let's see, there's a bunch of ones about cause of plague. Where did the plague originate from? That was one that was asked several times.
So the last, again, I haven't been keeping up, but the scholarship is fast evolving and usually involves a lot of sort of crossover work with genetics. Last I heard, the sort of consensus is hovering around originating in China in 1331. And it's sort of where it sort of took hold in a time of war and instability, and then sort of whipped along trade routes sort of into what's now Turkey, and then up through Europe. So yeah, I think that's the consensus, but again, it's not close enough to my own research to really effectively critique it.
Okay. Part of one, something else, let's see if I can find, there was one about the spread of plague. Let's see. Well, this one talks about, was there citizenship then? I mean, some countries weren't even countries yet. Did they try to cordon off each country and disallow travel? Did people have papers, etc.? How did citizenship play into quarantine?
So
Jessica Smith.
Jessica Smith, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Well, I mean, clearly there were sort of papers and passes that you could get for if you were healthy. You know, so for instance, in that last slide that we saw, or the second to last slide that we saw about health inspectors, you could be inspected and allowed to travel that way. And there were definitely restrictions on travel to and from certain areas. But as far as whether there were particular liberties conferred by citizenship, I don't know.
Here's a question about burials. This is Jessica Smith again. What kind of burials happened? I know not everyone could be buried, but what did people do with their dead at the time in Europe at the beginning of the plague?
Yeah, that's another huge problem. So again, we didn't get to talk about this, but one of the more horrifying aspects of plague was that you might be, if you were a plague victim, you might be denied the chance for a good death, right? So at all sorts of levels, you know, ideally, I mean, you hear accounts of funerals, and sometimes, you know, one funeral would expand into more than one funeral, you know, because of the scale of death. But more frightening to people was the idea that you might die either, you know, without having received last rites from a priest, or you might potentially die alone without your family around you, or you might die and be cast into a mass grave, which was not uncommon. So, in fact, some of the later sort of legislation, some of the mandates of health boards were that sort of all bodies must be collected and buried, and, you know, they would sort of come around and collect bodies, and sort of I believe Boccaccio actually talks about this, the sort of throwing bodies into just a common pit. And again, that's a terrible thing to have happen to one at this time. So that's one of the sort of auxiliary horrors of the plague.
We had a few questions about the persecutions against the Jews here. One was mortality among Jews lower than the general population due to their tradition to washing hands as part of religious requirements? And also, was there lower mortality due to the kosher diet? That's another one that people asked.
I've never, so first of all, I don't think hand washing would really help you in the case of plague, because it's conveyed either through flea bites or aerosolized droplets. So I don't think about that. More to the point, I've never read, most accounts actually suggest that mortality was roughly similar among Jewish communities as non-Jewish communities, which again is a point that many observers who are looking at these pogroms bring up, right? They say, well, you know, depending on how sympathetic one's position was, you would either sort of try to discount this, or you'd say that something's not right here. If the Jews are poisoning the Christians, then they're poisoning themselves too. This doesn't make sense. So most accounts seem to suggest mortality was basically as widespread.
And here's a couple of economic ones. Mac McClellan says, is there any evidence to how past plagues impacted economic growth and employment? And then another one, that did plague contribute to the fall of certain nations or the rise of others? And how did societies adjust to the greatly smaller population?
Yeah, so there's a lot of literature on this, more than I could sum up concisely here. But if people are interested, I could sort of put a bibliography online. As far as the fall or rise of particular nations, I can't think of any in particular, but I might be missing something. As for economic relations, yeah, so many of the, again, I skipped over this for time, but if you recall, like many of the observers, we were discussing how many of the observers sort of noted the breakdown of social order in the face of plague. And one of the things they almost invariably comment on is a change in labor relations, so that workers will not, and actually Boccaccio again says a little bit about this, but workers refuse to work for the low wages that they once worked for. And there was, in England, there was a decree that workers had to work for the same for pre-plague wages, and basically was unenforceable. Like you couldn't get people to work for the same amount of money as they did before, when in fact there was some sort of wage system. Economic growth was severely depressed across Europe. I mean, as one would imagine, with 1/3 of the population lost. In later accounts of the plague, in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, he discusses, this is sort of written after the fact in 1725 about the 1665 plague. But again, he discusses, the problem of having to, something that will sound familiar, having to shutter businesses and the economic effects of that on a community. Short answer is, and there's lots of literature on the most lasting effect seems to have been in sort of readjusting the ways in which people thought, at least in the economic sphere. The most lasting effect was adjusting the ways in which people thought about employment and labor and those sorts of dynamics, which again, you could think there are echoes in what we're sort of dealing with today in this country, is sort of thinking about how to make up for lost wages and people's, if you're of a particular political description, you might be very anxious that if we enact one policy, if we enact a policy of supplementing wages or of more generous unemployment, that won't go away after COVID passes. The same thing was being thought about in the 13 through 1600s.
Here's another group. Dorothy asks, the saints suffered and advocated, but did some saintly people also offer care for the suffering? Or never mind the saints, were there any social movements of care and compassion? And then we had another question that asks, who are the heroes of the plague?
Oh, here's the plague. Let me think about that last question. Who are the heroes? Yeah, so there are many sort of religious groups, especially, like minister to the sick and comfort the sick. And in fact, I mean, and this is again one of the places where this idea of contagion comes from, right? Because people do observe that if you're around plague victims, you tend to get plague more often, and this will strike certain orders that are taking care of plague victims. I mean, Saint Roch that we heard about is sort of known as for taking care of plague victims. There are other figures. For heroes, I can tell you what comes to mind. This is not a real hero, but Samuel Pepys was a British. What was he? I think he was in charge of some portion of the Navy. My memory is not working right now, but Samuel Pepys left a diary from the 1665 London plague. Well, by no means a heroic figure. At least I think he's a hero for historians, because he leaves this very detailed diary of what it was like to be in plague in London during 1665. Turns out that clubbing meant the same thing in 1665 as it does today. That has nothing to do with plague, but it's one of the leavings of Samuel Pepys.
Oh. I want to go back to some of the Boccaccio questions really quick, because I don't want to run out of time for them. We had a question as to why Boccaccio was chosen as the reading for this discussion. And then also, let's see, does comedy and humor surface at the very beginning of the prose? Would it have been performed humorously and dramatically to start? I only realized it was a comedy until I got to page 9.
Yeah, it is pretty. It's dry wit. So to the first question, why it was chosen, I guess because it provided two things. For one, it provides a pretty good sweeping, just sort of day-to-day description of what plague was like. So he goes through a lot of the sort of a lot of things that we talked about here, and we fleshed out in greater depth here. But he does so in a way that that assumes its naturalness. And so one thing that I find useful about the text in teaching is that it's useful to sort of go back, and this actually goes to the point about humor as well, right? It's useful to sort of read the text and ask, okay, so what would Boccaccio's readers or his audiences have understood to be the case, almost without him having to mention it, right, about this text. And so he's able to go very quickly through these various sort of episodes of plague, and he's sort of explaining it like, he's sort of coming at it from the side, right? He's saying like, listen, I know you don't want to hear about this, but let me just remind you really quick, something that we already know. We already know that's horrible, and I'm not gonna, right? I think we discussed this in earlier, Zoe, but the idea that the genre of the explanation for the ladies is a fairly sort of common repeating trope, right? So to appeal to the delicate sensibilities of the reader, right? You write a for the ladies explanation. It happens all the time in science too, actually, in explanations of chemistry for the ladies. And again, these are really good ways of getting at what a writer thinks is sort of both minimally important and sort of cast sort of like not as directly as an account of Gregorius of Constantinople or something like that. As far as the humor, wait, so what was the question about humor?
That they didn't realize it was a comedy right away. Is it a comedy?
I mean, some of the stories are wickedly funny in it. I mean, that's the other thing about it. Sorry, I should say the other thing I find personally fascinating, that again, the whole book isn't about plague, right? This is really, it's a book about sheltering in place, right? So it's this, Boccaccio uses the sort of the idea of plague to sort of wrap up this book about just stories, right? So the rest of the book is just these sort of noble people sitting in a villa and telling each other stories to bide their time while the plague rages around them, which again, some people tell each other stories, other people go to see a history of medicine lecture on Zoom. We all pass the time in our own ways.
Yeah, and one question says, the girls in the story only head out of the city for 2 miles. This seems like a flippant destination for all the deliberation of whether or not to head out. What do you make of this? Anything else you'd like to share about the reading?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Actually, I wonder if it's meant. This is great, because this is one of those things I had never considered as to whether it's supposed to be a flippant destination or whether that's supposed to be enough. Most people do flee further. I never really clocked that they were like, oh, I wonder if that is supposed to be a sort of pro forma, which would go to the idea that Boccaccio is not really interested in casting a narrative of plague so much as he's just trying to enable some sort of circumstance that will mash these people together to tell raunchy stories for however many pages, 300 pages.
There's a pretext.
Yeah, right.
One comment from a reader, Carolyn, from one of our attendees, Carolyn Craycraft, says in regards to burials that there are plague pits in London, one opposite the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is underneath a building now.
Yeah,
it's an interesting.
Yeah, they keep excavating them too. This is again something that is fascinating to sort of people who do sort of historically inflected biology, is that you can now go back into plague pits and actually sort of try to figure out what pathogen infected the people in the plague pits. And by and large, it does seem to be Yersinia pestis. But yeah, so these are kind of grisly historical documents in their own right.
All right, some related questions again. Were there famines caused by the plague? And what about children who are orphaned by the plague? You saw a lot of children in the pictures that you showed whose parents had died. Were there a lot of orphans as a result of the plague?
Yes, I'm not sure what happened to them, but you do hear, you do see concern in accounts from the period about, well, actually the two sort of often come up in conjunction. So you see that there aren't enough people to harvest, the crop, and therefore, that causes food supply problems. And you also see sort of anguish over this, both the moral and I guess both the moral and practical development of children who are, because there's not enough people alive to take care of them. So people frequently put it in terms of like reading and writing. So there aren't enough people to teach these children how to write or how to pray or things like this. As far as that, I don't. Someone must have this. I don't have any sort of statistics at hand over to like. There certainly must have been a surge in orphans, but I'm not sure.
A couple questions about fairy tales and nursery rhymes. Is the rhyme "Ring Around the Rosie" really about the plague? And also, is the Pied Piper story about the plague?
Never heard the Pied Piper one. I would say the Ring Around the Rosie one, no. The sort of folklorist consensus is not really. I think it appears in the 1800s, so that makes it like less likely that it would sort of survive intact as a plague, as a allegory for plague. Never heard the Pied Piper one. If I was to punt, my guess would be no, because again, the connection with rats seems wasn't really well articulated until the 1890s. Can I also answer your question? You asked a question yesterday about whether the word boo-boo is descended from boo-boo.
Yeah.
A little bit of etymological digging shows that the word boo-boo was first used in 1932.
So no.
Remarkably late. I would have had a much older provenance.
All right. Well, that's good to know. I did have a couple questions about how did the plague end? So if they weren't able to cure it, if they didn't understand how you got it, how did it come to an end in these various outbreaks?
So hotly debated topic again. The general, although not by no means like full consensus, is that it turns out that quarantine and cordon sanitaire actually did control movements of goods and people well enough to to allow plague to burn out in one place without going to another place, and we're going to see like sort of the greater and more substantial public health movements are thought to have helped with that. The sort of counter argument to this is that so that's the sort of the mainstream explanation, and that's the one that I propounded sort of not too forcefully, but towards the end of the talk. There are other explanations that suggest that perhaps so there's genetics work again that suggests that maybe Europeans gained a certain degree of genetic resistance to plague. There was a little ice age sort of in Europe, sort of after around the 17 or 1800s, that could have sort of suppressed the growth of fleas and things like this. There is again the thought there's the thought that actually like successive waves of plague weren't Yersinia pestis at all, but actually we're seeing the rise of sort of distinct groups of diseases and in fact they just sort of successively burn themselves out. But I think the most widely accepted explanation is that quarantine and cordon sanitaire and these sort of public health measures, which again sort of increase with greater and greater force and sophistication sort of throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, were responsible for at least sort of attenuating plague.
Great. Let's see.
The last thing I would add to that though is that it is still like it was still I mean the last plague outbreaks were in like India and China in the 19th and 20th, late 19th and early 20th century. So I mean, again, I don't mean to suggest that it was gone from the face of the earth by 1600. People are still quite frightened of it, right out of the 19th century.
Well, I think we're running out of time for most of these other ones. There's still a lot of questions. I may see if I can try to answer some of these later, but to sort of start to wrap up, this question says, I'm curious about your level of optimism about our society's capacity to manage this based on your learning of past coping. I appreciate the concept of the end of the world as we know it.
Well, dispositionally, I'm an optimist, actually. So I tend to tend to think that, you know, sort of the path of history bends towards righteousness, but I don't. But actually, I mean, I suppose actually the real historical answer would be that, yeah, these things, the ends of epidemics tend to be a mixed bag, right? So they tend to involve a lot of, well, as we're seeing right now, they tend to involve a lot of social upheaval. They tend to involve a lot of attempted retrenchment by sort of the powers that were in power before epidemics, and tend to resist change after the fact. So, I mean, I think one thing that I would want people to take away is that especially today, we tend to think of epidemic disease as being sort of external to society, right? Because we have this idea of germ theory, or we think of diseases as not something that really involves the social very much, right? But in fact, I think that we have a lot of power and a lot of say over, you know, what disease is and how we cope with disease. So I guess the optimistic part of me would sort of preach some sort of vigilance and action on the part of listeners. So rather than sort of, I use the idea of history bending, but rather people should try to bend history to the way that they want it to be, even with plagues and pandemics.
So I guess Dean's prerogative, even interim Dean's prerogative, is to ask the last question. First of all, I do want to thank everyone for coming and to encourage you to enroll in the next lecture. And that leads to my question. I don't know if you want to go through the slide, Michael, to our next, there's a website there that for the next lecture. Yep. What is the most surprising, or maybe this is a question you can answer the next time. What is the most surprising connection between plague and cholera? But maybe we don't have time to answer it. Maybe you have to start with that next time.
Yeah, let me do that. I think I like that idea.
All right. And then finally, as you contemplate the week ahead and the summer ahead, we invite you to consider some of the courses we'll have this summer at Graham. But we really hope to see you next week. And we thank you for joining us. And Michael, thank you for what was a really wonderful lecture. And Zoe, thank you for masterfully managing the Q&A. And we hope everyone has a good and healthy and safe evening and rest of the week.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Zoe. And thanks everyone for questions and for participation.
Thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you next week.